Thanks, Connor. Yeah, no, it's a lecture calling it too, so don't consider me rude if I rush off. Let me just start off with a couple of inspirations that in a way set the tone for what we're going to be occupied with for the next couple of minutes. These are just a couple of headline-grabbing attention seekers. Not all of them to be trusted, especially when you look at the word development in the Galway context very often means aspirational rather than actual development. But the gist of this is growth. Growth that's coming our way, growth that has been effectively coming our way over the last generation in some form or another. Growth that furthermore is not exceptional in a certain context. Growth that has been marking the world left, right, and center. You just get a sort of snapshot here of the last 50 years plus the next 20 or 35 years, and the curve, even though it's, as a geographer I have to point out to that, it's geographically diverse. Africa started at a very low point of urbanized areas, as indeed did, if I go back to the 1950s, Ireland to some extent. But the growth is a uniform one all over the globe, and it's called by the name of urbanization. Now, whatever we may think of urbanization, whether we like it or not, doesn't matter, it's going to happen anyway. But the one thing that we need to, and this is apropos the word sustainable in the title to this short enough talk, however we define sustainability, and one of the things I do with my students in the classroom is to deconstruct and dissect that word sustainable, because it means, as many people are in this room, as many definitions I could solicit from all of you. For some people it means sustaining what is. To other people it has a reference to a global exhaustion of the resources that we dwell on, and an implied sort of normative plea that we need to do something about this. So from a very conservative to a very progressive kind of angle, sustainability means a lot to a lot of people. But however we define it, the one thing that we really should part company with right away is the thought that this kind of growth is sustainable. It's happening. It denotes a movement of people from urban to rural area. It denotes a movement from people in largely rural parts of the world to the quote-unquote more developed parts of the world, but that entails a movement also to urban areas. So however we approach it, we're not going to square that circle right away. However, what we can do, and this is what my talk is built around, we can aim to make urban life more rather than less sustainable, and we can aim to decarbonize life more generally. Decarbonization means we unhinge our dependency on carbon-based energy sources, energy generating sources. Since more and more people live in urban areas, it's incumbent upon us to accept that cities will become the hotbed, the experiment, the laboratory where we need to get things right. Amongst the many things that we should be aiming to get right, we're focusing today, I'm focusing for the sake of this talk on transport. But don't for a second think that transport is the only thing, the only show in town, or is indeed the most important thing that we need to get right. There are many, many other things that in a way are interconnected with transport, but to some extent have a life of their own. Flooding, housing, consumption, waste, removal, waste, generation, the sealing off of land, it's all interconnected, but each one would warrant a talk in its own right in some form or another. Transport, and Connor alluded to that in passing, we need to remember is a socially produced practice. It's not something that exists in and of its own right, but it exists because modern cities in particular, but we can go back to the earliest formations of cities in Mesopotamia, they inherit and dwell on and develop divisions of labor. And it's these divisions of labor between places where we live, places where we work, places where we shop, places where we furthermore entertain ourselves, and we're in one of those places, where normally we entertain ourselves, they attract traffic. People travel to them. We travel to work, we travel for shopping, we travel to meet people. That's all bought by or created by spatial divisions of labor. And the key thing to note right away, before we go any further, is that you cannot tackle traffic in isolation. You need to think of traffic as an interconnected node in many different separations of different spaces. And unless we situate traffic in the midst of all of that, we're not going to solve very much. In fact, thinking of traffic in isolation goes amiss. Now, traffic, furthermore, comes in many shapes and guises. I'm just giving you here travel within urban arenas, just some snapshots, again, to alert us to the fact that when we think of traffic, we shouldn't just think of this, although that is perhaps first and foremost on our minds, but we should think of traffic as a mix, as a modal mix of different ways of going about. Many of you, I assume, would have walked to this talk. Others took a car. Some of you may have cycled. I assume nobody was able to take that quite yet, but we're aiming to rectify that in some form or another. So, and this is just travel within cities. You will note that there's no aeroplane on this, but if we scale this up, as geographers are wont to do, I could have included aeroplanes, I could have included real-life trains in this to just stress the fact that the kinds of traffic that we generate vary across scale. Furthermore, honing in on the urban arena, we have what we refer to as different modular splits coming to the fore with each city, within each city. And I've just given you two here, the 2011 modular split for Galway, set alongside, somewhat facetiously, the similar modular split for Munich. In fact, you could say what the modular split is sort of an imprint. It's sort of the fingerprint that a city emits. But other than a fingerprint, this can be changed. And indeed, it's part of our remit to change that modular split. It wasn't always thus in Munich. Technology has changed, policies have changed, and politics have changed. And trust me, we need to do something about this in order to get things right. Now, I could talk at some length about why this particular modular split, the car-dominated modular split, came into existence. What the reasons are for our car dependency. And I would talk about everything from my favorite Top Gear to car advertisements run during Super Bowl football matches to ideas of masculinity that are tied in with identity about fast moving cars, to the idea that this one, which we actually don't think about very often, contrary to expectation, the car has become a much, much safer mode of transportation over the last 100 years. So there's safety concerns that are part and parcel of this, as is the construction of infrastructure. Every time our government builds a road, it is effectively putting its might behind that brown part of the circle. I could furthermore talk about the consequences of this car dependency at some length, and I'd be talking about air pollution, urban congestion. I'd be talking about rising obesity rates everywhere where the car dominates. I'd be talking about the destruction of functioning neighborhoods, what Robert Putnam has referred to as the bowling alone. We move from our place where we sleep to the place where we work. And if you think that we in Galway have it bad, you know, when you read about people in Dublin sitting in the car 2 hours to drive to work and 2 hours to drive back to work, only to do the same thing again a couple of hours later, you're beginning to get the gist of what kind of consequences this has on our everyday life. We could talk about transport-based forms of discrimination, because where people live has an impact on how much or how often they can participate in social events of this kind. If you happen to live out somewhere where where you cannot afford this, and this public transportation isn't available, then the chances of you being able to come to a talk of this kind, or indeed to come to an evening performance in this theatre, are very slim on the ground indeed. We could talk about carbon or energy that is effectively wasted, because this is not the most efficient way of moving bodies through space. We could talk about at length, and this is in fact what we'll be doing for the rest of this talk, about urban sprawl. I could furthermore, and this is just to give you an idea of what a talk about transport should be like, if it's not squeezed into a lunchtime hour of this kind, we could talk about what the future holds for us. You all will have talked or will have read about, the future of transportation when it comes to electric vehicles. You will have all read about the experiments that are currently ongoing about self-driving cars. All of this will impact mightily upon this. Closer to home, we have technology helping us in the form of intelligent signage. Although occasionally when I drive through Galway, I wonder just how much intelligence goes into the signage, the red lights. There's anecdotal, I shouldn't perhaps say this because I don't know if anybody from Town Hall is in here, but when I moved to Galway 20 years ago and I recognized that the signage, the red lights, they weren't in sync with one another. I asked somebody, I went to actually John Tierney over there in City Hall, and I said, well, surely, these red lights can be intelligently linked with one another. He didn't let anything out, but I heard anecdotal evidence then that they had just employed a young upstart, who knew his IT and who had sort of configured it all to work fluidly, only to at night somebody else come in and changes back to the reset button to make sure that it all worked the way that it always worked. So intelligent signage could alleviate some of the problems here. We could have policy nudges. And indeed, we see policy nudges left, right, and centre. The moment the EU issues a directive on what kind of cars are allowed to drive in the city, my fellow Germans, they all bought diesels. They're now frightened stiff that they can't drive their diesel into the city centre because of prohibitive kind of legislation that simply says, look, you're emitting the wrong kind of fumes, not just too much, but the wrong kind of fumes, and therefore your car will not be allowed to drive into the inner city. Which obviously the hope is that people, after they've been nudged, will change their behavior. We could talk about sustainable urbanism left, right, and centre. We could talk about walkability as a game, as an aim in town. We could talk about the 2002 Melbourne Principles as a way forward to change our cities, the way that we interact with urban space, and move us not just from this to that, but make us all become more sustainable in our traffic-related consumption pattern. In fact, using the word sustainable consumption is another way of addressing this switch from a waste-based transportation system to one that makes more sense from a carbon point of view, but also from a community, better ways of living point of view. I could talk all about that, and each one of these, trust me, with Mary in the room here, each one of these would warrant a talk in its own right. But that's just to give you a flavor of how multifaceted and interesting this whole area is. But I shan't be doing that, because I want to focus for the remaining 20 or so minutes on Galway. If we think about traffic in Galway, the one thing that sticks out by way of explaining how we got to the mess that we're in today, we have to go back to the 1950s, and we have to look at the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and ongoing to the present moment growth of suburbia, where we followed a particular model. And that was, we built estates left, right, and centre. Planners designated a space where we could sleep, where we could build our dormitories, mind you, not where we could work and sleep, but where we were allowed to sleep. We built estates around that. Very often those estates are self-enclosed. Where I live out in Knocknacarra, if my children want to visit their fellow pupils that they meet in school on the weekend, They can't just walk from one estate to the other. They actually have to walk out of the estate, walk around the estate on the main road, and then go into another estate. So we've conceptualized not just our sleep spaces as estates, we also conceptualize these estates as self-enclosed estates. And to my mind, there are 4 drivers, if drivers they can be called, that are in a way responsible for this. The first one is to some extent peculiar to Ireland. I've worked and lived in many, many countries. I've yet to see a country where land holds as much emotional value as it does in Ireland, for all the reasons that we need not go into. You know, they're historical for most of the time, but it has become a fetishization of space. Even if we don't use the front and the backyard to our self-enclosed houses out there in Knocknacarra, we still want there to be some kind of green space, even if at the end of the day we hardly have the time to mow the lawn or do anything to it. Secondly, and this is universal all over the world, at least since the 1830s, the conceptualization of the home as a commodity. We're all tied into the capitalist economy through home ownership. We fool ourselves into thinking that the moment the value of the house goes up, we're all better off. We would be better off if we could sell our houses every week, yes, but we don't. So it's a mental construct that we all think, you know. Part of this has to do with inheritance. You know, we can pass on some of the accumulated gains to our children, but it has serious and severe repercussions. There's a bit of a cultural aversion against living in flats. I do remember first time I took a group of students, this is 15 years ago, to Barcelona. Barcelona is one of the most dense urban areas in Europe. And I remember we walked through the Raval, which is, in Barcelona, it's even the most dense sort of part of the world. You know, we walked there and a wonderful young student, you know, came up to me and sort of nudged me and said, "Ulf, can I ask you a question?" I said, "Yeah, that's why we're here." She said, "Well, you know, I didn't know that people raised families in flats, in apartments." And it dawned on me then, as I was listening to her, you know, how deeply rooted this is. You know, translates into the reality of the property ladder. You know, we buy when we're young, we buy a flat, but we try to part company with flat-based modes of living the moment we get married and we have children. So there's a very cultural sort of side to things. The result of this is that low-density, car-based forms of living. And just in case anybody's under any illusion that this is the norm everywhere, it's not. So here we are, you know, private rent, social rent, you know, we're talking about less than 30% here. Rent at market value in Germany. The only country that outdoes us is Poland in terms of private ownership within the EU. Small wonder that so many Polish people find a home here, emotionally and for real. Jesus. I don't want to listen to myself. Now, here's the consequence of that. Oh. Thank you. Here's the consequence of that. And note the similarity between Knocknacarra and a randomly selected suburb around Sydney. That is the mode that we're copying. That's the mode that we're following. And the result is that. But there isn't just the suburbs that in a way we need to think about and that we need to get right or need to think about. Beyond suburbia, we have that part of the town that we're currently in, the center of town. And that town has been reshaped in the lifetime of many of you following the 1986 Urban Renewal Act, which brought about the wonders of pedestrianisation. And I trust there's hardly anybody in this room that would want to go back to shop streets being filled with cars. We all cherish our inner city as a result of that. But we also cemented, for real, the car into the heart of our city. We even built car parks right in the heart of our city to induce people to get to the inner city while driving. So, in a way, we purchased this, the beauty of pedestrianisation, with, I mean, this for me is the aberration You know, Merchants Row should never, ever have been built like that. A dual carriage lane right through the heart of the city. But note how the two are interconnected. This, in our minds, facilitates that. And the result is something like this. Prime estate. If I were to approach this from a real estate kind of person, I would say this is prime real estate. If I look at this as an urban planner, I would say, for heaven's sake, can't we find better use for central space such as this, rather than parking cars thereupon? And that is, with all due respect to anybody who came to this talk and whose car is now parked on this particular site. But you get my drift, you know. Even knowing, as we all do, you know, that Galway Cathedral was a prison at one point, and one could think about, you know, this car park imprisoning all of our mental attitudes and building bridges left, right, and centre. Trust me, that would be, from an urban design point of view, the first thing that one would tackle in some form or another. And tackle we are, or tackle we shall. There are a couple of things that are currently in the pipeline, currently being debated. Remedies, some, delightful flights of fancy, others. But at the very least, I have to say, again, having lived here for 18 years, to correct myself, the last year and a half has been a hotbed of debates, has been finally, you know, that traffic has come to the forefront of planners and our collective imagination, mostly due to the publication in June 2016 of the Galway Transport Strategy, which, this is straight from said strategy, you know, whatever you may think about the strategy per se, which I think is actually quite good, but perhaps I'm saying that because I know that nothing was there before it. Where now we're talking about, you know, the primary goal of land use and transport, you know, reduce, promote walking. Clearly these are pointers in a direction that many of us would cherish in some way or another, even though the consequences may well demand rather profound change on all of us. I'm just taking out here, you know, the reimagination of the heart of Galway that would ensue if this Galway transport strategy were to be translated into reality, where from here to there and beyond, we're looking at a street that effectively will be sealed off from private cars. So for once, actually, our planners have ambition planted on their frontal lobes in extremis. You know, if I imagine this whole area, which I'll be walking back in 20 minutes, being deprived of cars, and may I point to this particular idiocy, pardon my French, which really is an accident waiting to happen. We can clearly see that whether or not this will translate into reality remains to be seen, but it's ambitious in a very direct manner. At the same time, however, we may repeat some of the mistakes that, if not we ourselves, then at least other cities have made by pursuing the outer bypass, if indeed pursuing it we are. I am not entirely sure whether that the heart of all people who are promoting this particular solution to our traffic woes is really into this. I shan't pronounce any verdict on the outer bypass. We all know that it'll solve some of the issues. It'll generate new traffic in its kind. For me, the most striking of difficulties with embracing this particular vision of where Galway should develop and how it should try to solve its traffic problems isn't the route, isn't the idea of the bypass. No, it's these spots that will develop into a very American style out-of-town shopping paradise, and which will negatively impact upon the inner city. So if I were to own Anthony Ryan's shop or my good friend Brendan Holland there, I would not try to get this thing off the ground, because it'll negatively impact upon inner city shopping. So what, by contrast, we ought to do is strengthen the beating heart of our city. And I think that's where perhaps the Galway transport strategy is better. Occasionally we get things right. Occasionally we're ambitious in the right kind of, with the right kind of heart, and if you look at the strategies, cycling proposals, what's not to like? You have an east-west corridor, you have the much anticipated cycle route eventually to Clifton, but hey, we're happy if it actually reaches Moycullen in our lifetime in some form or another, and then you get these secondary and tertiary roads, Now there are two things that make me slightly cynical about this. The one is that for the longest time our planners couldn't get the width of those cycle lanes right, and their insistence on simply spray painting something onto the roads and saying that's it, you're all safe now, makes me guess their intentions. And the second thing is these green things. I live out here. I'd love nothing more than to finally not have to cycle on the prom and incur the wrath of the guards left, right and centre. When you look at the finer detail of that in the plan, there's the fine print, the asterisk there that always says, subject to, and subject to means in this case, subject to the approval of landowners adjacent to that road. Which, if we go back to the primacy of land ownership in Ireland, I can just about say, this is, again, a flight of fancy, I can't see it happening, even though it should. And given the east-west orientation of Galway, this would make life so much easier. As, and this, dear friends, is the partisan part of the talk. I should have owned up at the beginning saying that I'm, for the last 12 years, although there was a long interlude of non-activity in between, known as the crash, when just the thought of building something infrastructural in Galway was just not happening in anybody's mind. But I've been involved in the possible construction of a light rail or tram line in Galway. This is what we came up with at the time, following the east-west orientation of Galway City. We could actually do it with 2 lines. 2 lines would solve the problems more or less directly in some form or another. Light rail solutions. This, again, full disclosure, is my hometown where I grew up. If you think of light rail as being just simply sealing up the land, the engineers in Freiburg pioneered this sort of green track technology, where 70% of all of the light rail tracks are actually green. So they absorb the rain, they don't seal off the land. They've copied that in the recent construction of a ring railroad around Paris. And while we're dreaming over lunchtime, we may well indulge in that. Here are some of the kind of pros or the kind of pushers that might help us in Galway. The one is the east-west orientation. It's a city that, if planning were to apply properly, you could extend in an east-west sort of dimension. And the plans that are currently in the making for Ardán kind of extend that kind of thinking further eastward. You could, as a result, achieve what traffic planners refer to as the PED shed. The PED shed is the watershed that applies to designate an area that people are willing to walk towards a tram stop, which in most books you'll find referred to as 500 meters. Obviously, this is assuming an able-bodied kind of normal citizen, which doesn't apply in all cases, but 500 meters, if you extend that along north and south of the line that I've just shown to you, you actually capture more than 73% of Galwegians in some of them. Trams are punctual and quick, and they are, lest we forget, in a different kind of class situation to buses. Buses are a poor man's travel means, like it or not. They can be nice, they can be new, there is a segment of the population that will never get into buses. Trams, by contrast, you know. I remember one of the people who was instrumental in getting the Lewis in Dublin on the thing, you know, he was beaming with joy after being able to say, we now got the suits. Meaning, we don't just capture the poor and social classes that are relying on public transportation because they can't afford a car. No, we get the people who voluntarily move on a public transportation system. So that's the considerable lower class dimension there in some way or another. Now the elephant in the room is this. Virtually everything that I've pointed towards as solutions requires, builds on, encourages higher forms of density. There are different ways of achieving this. Roddy Mannion, in his very good book on Galway, 2012, talks at length, there's 5 pages in there, on roof homing, basically adding 1 or 2 stories to Knocknacarra. At the moment I flag that to my neighbours, they will say, how did you ever become a professor? You know, that's just plain bonkers, you know. But it's worth thinking about, the retrofitting of our environments. You know, what can we do to achieve higher densities? Brownfield generation, I'll give you an example in a second. And obviously, the onus is on us to conceptualize new spaces of the Ardán type in a different manner. Different, I mean, from the Knocknacarras of the world. But there are other things that we can do. School admission policies. My kid goes to St. Enda's because I went to St. Enda's and my father went to St. Enda's, but I now live in Tuam. Excuse me. You know, we cannot afford that kind of folly anymore. Flexible work and school hours. Why do all schools have to start at the same or in the same window of opportunity? My kids go to Enda's, you know, it was stop. I mean, we were flagged a major break of, you know, sort of existing cultures when they started not at 9 but at 10 to 9, you know. What's wrong with some schools starting at 8:30 and others at 9:30? We all adjust to that. The same goes to work. At least my employer 12 years ago shifted to flexible work hours. Mary Cawley will remember that, you know, when we identified core hours. 10 to 4 is when you have to be at your desk. But that doesn't add up to the 40 hours that we owe our employer. So you either come in at 6 or at 8, and you go at 2:45 or whenever, you know, or 4. But leave it to us to make sense of how we want to engage with our workplaces. Tackling hard to break habits is another thing, you know. I mean, why does Galway get completely congested at 2 on a Friday afternoon? Because everybody tries to get their shopping done for the weekend, you know. And finally, integrated and intelligent forms of land zoning would go a long way to doing this. Let me give you an example. I mentioned to you that I hail from Freiburg. Here's an addition to, actually very comparable to what we're trying to do in Ardán, known as the Rieselfeld. Rieselfeld was the space where the manure just trickled into the ground. So this is a space for about 9,000, so it's double what Ardán may or may not do. But note 2 things. The higher density. I've seen the plans for Ardán, they're actually not bad, but they stop at the 3rd. You know? Custom now demands 5 to 6 stories as the norm for some kind of dense urbanity that is conducive to running a public transportation system. And note, the axis here of the spine, the planned spine of that development was a tram line. Again, a green tram line. So you don't start building until you have the infrastructure in place. Compare and contrast that with Knocknacarra, where I think the only thing that they put in place was the church, and kudos to them, at least they thought that far. But Joyce's was an afterthought, as were all the schools, which now miraculously find themselves on the outskirts of Knocknacarra, meaning everybody's again driving their kids to school. Now, this is for new development. As concerns existing development, what we could aim for, and I owe this particular line of thinking to Kevin Layden, is nodal densification or transit-oriented development, where once we've identified the lines, we've put them in there at the stops, at the tram stops ideally, but bus stops may well serve a purpose here as well. We aim for higher densities. So, if this, again from Roddy Mannion's book, is the proposed transit corridor for traffic in Galway, to which the gluish person that I am would add this kind of U-shaped addition. But this would already capture the 72 that I mentioned earlier, with the pitch head of 500. If we just hone in on my home turf here, I'm delighted to see that there's planning permission sought for 94 apartments here. We already achieve higher densities here. This whole area, with Aldi here and Duns there, would be akin to this, could achieve. You have a bus stop here, you have a bus stop there. This is up for development. What's wrong with putting a bit higher densities in there? We still have some way to go here in terms of brownfield generation, west side, O'Higgins side there, perfect for achieving just that type of higher density. So perhaps, famous last words, the elephant in the room isn't actually an elephant in the sense that we can ill manage said beast, but perhaps it's also an opportunity that we just need to get our head around, look at maps and identify sites that would be conducive to achieving those higher densities, even without touching much of what many of us still like about Galway. Thanks for your attention, and I think we have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions. Yeah.
One very quick point on the flights of fancy becoming reality. I'm coordinating a petition campaign for light rail provision.
Yeah.
I'm sure many people in the room already know about this. Some may already have signed a petition. Could I pass around
Oh, yes.
the petition? Brilliant. There's 2 copies of the petition, just a name and a contact if you could. Here.
Does anybody have a question? I mean, just. I said before I had to dash off, but it's not that quick. So, yes.
I agree with everything you say. I regret that what you say is not being implemented in Galway. I mean, you mentioned Ardon there, for instance.
Yep.
It's an opportunity to do what you say. But when you talk to the planners and when you look at the local area plan, the big problem is that nobody's factoring in the sustainable transport properly.
That was it.
It's surrounded on 3 sides by dual carriageways or motorways.
Yeah.
And okay, it says we will have a bridge here, we will have a bridge there, but you ask the planners, when would that be? Oh, that's not our business, that's for somebody else to do.
Yeah.
So they're going to build Ardon, and with no connections, you can't walk out of it, you
Nope.
can't cycle out of it. So we're about to repeat the mistakes that have always been made when we have an opportunity to.
I agree. I took some note from the fact that they at least put in some sort of bus priority corridor. But again, if you, the power of maps, you look at the map on that plan, and the bus lines, they're dashed grey, sort of receding into the background. They're as if the planners who draw the plans want to make sure that everybody gets it, that these are afterthoughts rather than primers. You need to really just put a bold line in there and say, here is priority given to public transportation. Here are the links into and out of the estate, even though it's not an estate kind of thing. And then have the courage to add 1 or 2 stories to it, and you get somewhere. Yeah, Derek.
Currently, there are 3 regeneration areas in Galway: Kent Station, the Harbour, and Edford Road. If you look at the development plan and the proposals that have already come forward for a couple of those sites, it's all office development, it's all development of retail, no housing or very little housing in the city centre. Traditionally, communities in Galway thrived in the city centre. over the last 40 years, people have been pushed out to the periphery, which is the problem.
Yep.
19,000 people have to drive every day back into the city to get to work. We have those areas that could double the core centre of the city for housing, and it's not being done.
And note that we haven't even talked about social housing yet, or affordable housing that would make these mixed in orientation, mixed in cultural and in social class dimensions, So, I despaired at that myself, And the way it's sold then, it's mixed cultural quarters, When you look at the fine print, what these are effectively, they will become privately owned social spaces, where there's a private police running around, and the poor homeless person who ventures in there will be escorted out from the word go before he or she even thinks of laying their weary bodies onto some ground or onto some bench. A bench, trust me, that will be designed as to not accommodate a human body in its elongated shape, to make sure that nobody's tempted to put his or her weary body onto it. So we're repeating the mistakes that London made over the last decade or so. Paternoster Square comes to my mind, as the space that most obviously is gone wrong, Any other question? Time for one more, perhaps. Yeah.
I certainly appreciate what you have in Freiburg, the Straßenbahn and the whole public system, and everybody uses it and they're all full, but I think a big part of that is because they're reliable. And it looks like with a light rail system that's going to take another maybe 10 years before it becomes actual. And in the meantime, I think we really have to find ways to show that our present system is reliable so that more people will use it. So how do we do that?
More important even than that, we have to make sure that what we build now can accommodate our future plans and desires. So that we're not building cities where, in the end, Knocknacar is a good example, Thankfully, we have the Western Distributor Road. Can I tell you one thing? The first public act that I made when I came here, I wrote to City Hall and said, why on earth could nobody come up with a better name for this road, Western Distributor Road? And I suggested something like, Mahatma Gandhi Boulevard or whatever. Now I'm actually quite happy that it's called Western Distributor Road because it denotes the functionality. And into the Western Distributor Road, you can embed a tram line so beautifully without changing anything in your public imagination, because it's really just what it is, a link road, which actually has developed some nice kind of tree cover over the last decade or so. All right.
In the meantime, why don't they put the bus from Knocknacar to Parkmore rather than every bus goes into the city, stops?
Here.
Yeah.
I agree. No, there are easy remedies that one could institutionalize. I don't think it's going to take 10 years, actually. It could be done quicker.
Have you ever given a reason for no bus going across the Kendall Bridge?
Stasis. We've always done it this way. Don't touch that. That kind of, People aren't adventurous. People aren't you have to, that's my sense, you have to give people a reason to change. And if you're running a bus system, I have to give them kudos. Where I live, the bus is now running on time, rather than to an imaginary timetable. It's actually punctual, it's reasonably reliable, bar between 3 and 9 and 4 and 6, which is arguably where most people would want to use a bus, but never you mind that. They've made an effort. But it's a quantum leap from where they are to where they must get.
Because it's every half hour. It should be every 15 minutes.
I agree. Folks, duty calls. Thank you very much for your